is round two because we just, you know what, we argue and fuss enough in our earlier episode of Empty Friday. So we're doing round two this Friday of Empty Fridays because there's just so much to talk about. And we're filling the brain drain one unscripted conversation at a time. So we decided to come back to, the truth of the matter is that we, after we get off of our conversation and finish videoing every week our Empty Fridays, we have another conversation for 2 or 3 hours oftentimes. And so like we just decided to go live. And we were just talking in our last episode this morning about protests. And this I got off.
Give me 1 second. I'm bringing it to the sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm bringing it to Instagram since we're going live.
Mm.
Which makes me create a different key for it.
Okay. But I was talking about how I wrote the editorial board or whatever at the New York Times because they're not covering protests, and I just jumped on Instagram a few minutes ago, and boom! I don't know when this is. It just says incredible footage of a massive anti-Trump Musk protest that broke out in New York City. MAGA is awakening a sleeping giant. So there are absolutely conversations going on these days and protests about what is going on in our society. And that brings me some measure of absolute hope, actually, because I don't know. It makes us know that we're not alone. Okay, I'm doing some crazy things with the what. Why is the ad source there? I don't want that there.
I don't know what you're doing.
I don't either.
I don't know what I'm doing either because I tried to add the. This is why we don't probably do one afterwards, or
So in our last conversation, we were talking about autism. I work part-time as a learning and training management for a school and organization that serves neurodivergent students and mostly autistic students from the kindergarten, pre-K, all the way to adulthood, and some of our other respite programs and things of that nature. And because of my relationship with you, I'm having a deeper understanding of what autism is. I mean, because when I was growing up, autism, it may have been a thing, but it was nothing that we talked about or people knew. And talking about people on the spectrum and things of that nature, it just wasn't a thing. And so, I'm still learning, about this. And we were just having a conversation in our last segment about, I kind of think sometimes that I may be on the spectrum, and my friend Tahitia, who is autistic, said you may have some traits. So what are these traits that you see that I may have?
So, and listen, I am not an autism expert. I am an expert in my own autism. So, just to preface this from my perspective, I was diagnosed now about probably 7 years ago. So later in life. But when I think about the things that like I learned about autism, I probably should have, or maybe I was diagnosed earlier. I don't know. My parents aren't great historians when it comes to this type of stuff. But some of the things that I will say as an adult, what led me to seeking that diagnosis or to learning more about myself was there were certain things that I struggled with. And most of them had to do with social interactions. Like feel exhausted if I have to interact with a whole bunch of people. And I never understood why like I don't have a cup of social activity like a social cup that's overflowing with energy. It always feels kind of empty. And I always kind of felt like when I had to do stuff like that, I had to like get super prepared and like kind of talk myself up to going out, talk myself up to like going to like even family events, talk myself up to family events, talk myself up to like work stuff. And whenever I would go to those things, I always sort of felt like on the outside looking in, even if I was leading it, even if I was like the person who was supposed to set the tone for it, I always didn't feel quite like I fit in with that. But I would not have called that autism at the time. I just thought I was socially awkward. But the big driver for me was someone said to me that I didn't seem to care about them and what was wrong with me. Like, you don't care about me. Like, and this was someone who I thought I really displayed caring behaviors for, who I was close with. And I thought, what am I missing? Like, is there something wrong with me that like people don't think I care about them or don't think that, why don't I have long lasting relationships with other people? Or it gets to a point where someone would come and in my love life too, would come to me and they say like, I really don't feel like you care about me. And I'm thinking like I'm giving all the care feels and like, really what I'm doing is like I'm probably doing more like body doubling activities with them. I'm not interacting with them, but I feel like I'm interacting with them because I'm in the same room with them, because that counts for me as like I feel like I'm interacting because we're both in the same space, but we're working on something different. Neurotypical people don't tend to see that as like we're having great interactions.
Wow.
Whereas I'm like, I'm sharing space with you. Because
Interesting.
they're like, from my understanding, is that they're looking for more of a like, now we're having a dialogue and we're doing something together. Whereas I feel if I'm in the space with you doing something, we're doing something together. Cause like we're both blessing each other with our energies. And
Oh,
like,
I feel
I
that
don't
way.
and I don't need to I'm very talkative, but I don't need to be talking. Sometimes I'm super quiet. And so that also in common spaces with people can be seen as like, oh, this person doesn't really want to be here. They're not interacting. And so I see some of that, or like I don't see it with you, but you've described experiences like that. And I also will get super interested in certain things that kick off from something I've seen. Like I got really interested in infection control because I read an article about like infections in central lines. And then this was years ago. I couldn't get enough of it. And I see the same with you. Like you're a big researcher, you get fascinated by topics and you dive deep into them. I'm not saying that means for everyone that they're autistic, but for me, I started to like I went to a therapist and then they because I was describing some of my battles, or not battles, but hurdles for things that I was struggling with, and they said like, "Have you ever thought you might be autistic?" And I was like, "What? What?" Because in my mind, I had this thought about what autism looks like. I had this thought that autism was very rigid. I felt like, no, I'm like empathetic. I've had social relationships with people. Like, how could I possibly be autistic? Now, in the US, the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual, changed how they categorized autism. So there used to be a diagnosis called Asperger's, right? Do you remember that? And that was when you think about Asperger's, what do you think of?
I think of someone that's high functioning. They're I don't know. I just think about someone that can be very smart. They can be high functioning. They could have some neural divergence on some level. Um, I, I saw it as something kind of separate from autism.
'Cause it was separate, and so the 2 were separated, and I remember this from my nursing practice, right? I've been a nurse for over 20 years, and so we had 2 different diagnoses and or 2 different ways to put these into buckets. When the new DSM came out, they rolled them together, realizing that even for people who would have been diagnosed with Asperger's, which Asperger's is still the diagnosis overseas. The UK still uses that. Australia still uses that as the diagnosis, but they saw it as a spectrum because if you have Asperger's, you had a lot of the same markers for autism, right? So if this were a spectrum, there are moments when I could have some mutism where I feel overwhelmed and don't really talk. And so I would ask you to, when you think of autism, what pops into your head?
Hmm. Well, I don't know what pops into my head. I work with, well, I work in HR and training, but, in the school, I work, what pops in my head is there are some behaviors, and again, depending upon, where people are, there are some behaviors. There are some people who, if you didn't know that they had a autism diagnosis, you might not know. And then there's some kids or some people that you look at and you can tell, wow, something's going on with them. They may have outbursts. They may have they can have violent behaviors. They can have self-harming behaviors. They can have withdrawal behaviors, sensitivity to noise and light. I had someone share with me that their adult child said to them, and they were shocked. They had said to them one day, I was not happy as a child, and the person's child was, high functioning with autism, and they said, I wasn't happy as a child, and the mother was really surprised and kind of bewildered, because she thought that I had done everything that I could to create a happy life for my kid, and what the person's child had shared with them is like, going to school was torture, like going into the lunchroom, right? It's loud. It's there's so many things that are inundating your senses, light, sound, smells, all of those things were just really overwhelming for that person. And life was really overwhelming for them. And that wasn't something, and I'm certain that she did her best, to be a great mom, but something that she's not aware of. And I think a lot of folks carry a lot of things with them that nobody is aware of. So
Mhm.
that's kind of, you know, some of the my understanding.
Yeah, and so, like, the only reason I said and so for those who might be popping in, Melonya and I are talking about I said something to her on our live about how I thought she had some some behavior signs that maybe she was on the ASD spectrum with me. And so I think we're seeing a lot more adults talk about ASD because and women and people of color, particularly because we were not necessarily diagnosed at the same rates as young boys. Um, so I think when I got my diagnosis, I sort of was like, oh, I get some of my behaviors. And so when the US rolled in the Asperger's into ASD, I think it got a little bit more confusing too, because now we talk like there's a lot of talk about high functioning, low functioning, which I feel is problematic because on the day that I was diagnosed, right, it was ASD level 1, which is like you have low support needs, but sometimes there are days when I'm overstimulated,
Mm.
like I'm just not able to kind of function in the world the same way. Where if I had been like assessed that day, would it have been a different diagnosis? I don't know. So when they say it's a spectrum in the US with that sort of, like they're really, I like to think of it as like some days I'm probably doing a little bit better than other days. And I hate to say function because, um, like, I don't think the world is made for people that are different from what we consider neurotypical functioning. Um, I think maybe there's more people that are neurodiverse in their mindsets and cognitive functioning than there are people that are on the neurotypical. And the only reason I say that is more people seem to be kind of unmasking the fact that life is very difficult with all of the stimulation that goes on. I do think the world is a lot more stimulating than it was. I do feel like with all of the technology and all of the things that we have, it's much more stimulating for those who might be neurodiverse. Um, I remember the first time I walked into a like overhead, the overhead lighting was like that. What's that halogen? Or it's like the really bright stuff. I don't think they use it anymore.
Fluorescent.
Fluorescent. And I remember years
Like
ago, I
gold.
walked into well, I think they did something because it doesn't impact me as much as it used to. Certain stores, I think they're using something. But, like, that type of lighting used to just exhaust me because everything seemed too bright. I could hear like, this is gonna sound a little odd, but, like, I hear a lot of electricity stuff, and I think you shared with me, like, you hear the hum of electricity. Like, a lot of autistic people will talk about, like, "I hear electrical stuff." Like, it bugs me, and sometimes I hear it more than other times, which is, like, that's like how much reserves do I have? If I have to mask and appear like I hate the word normal, but like like an acceptable version of me for society, I'm beat. I'm exhausted. It's why I don't like to necessarily do in-person things because there's a different amount of give that comes from in-person things than virtual stuff. And I just sort of got some of that vibe from you. That, the outside world is very stimulating. And I'm not saying that you
Mhm.
are autistic, even though I did say, I think if there were
Well, no,
one word, I was like, you have some markers.
no,
But those are the ones I see. And you also have some great special interests.
I,
Um,
when you said special interest, I probably know more about camels than you would expect me to know. And that was triggered by the "It's Hump Day." You remember that commercial, right? I love that commercial so much that it made me want to do research on camels. And then I know that there's one hump camels and two hump camels, and that alpacas and llamas are part of the camel family. And I know because that's the way I think. One weekend, or I love animals. I love, 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 love animals, right? And I love bears. And one weekend, I just binged on, well, it was bear attacks. I, I used to think that I could live in the woods, right? And then I saw these bear attack um, uh, stories, and I was like, no, I don't have what it takes to live in the woods. And in my fantasy, I do. But some years ago, I went to the Catskills to go glamping in a yurt by myself, and I stepped out of the car, and the first thing that I was met with was silence. And that was so glorious. I mean, it was quiet. I didn't even hear birds. It was just quiet. And it felt so soothing to me. So lights, I don't typically I don't have on a lot of I like natural light. I don't do overhead lights in the office when I go into the office. I sounds I'm very, very, very sensitive to sounds. I'm a kind of a sensitive soul, in many ways, and feel I really feel that being out in the world is really kind of an assault to the senses, right? When I think back on my socialization, right? I'm a one-on-one person. I would have friends that I would only meet with that friend, or I'd only meet with this friend. I'm not a big, I'm extremely shy. Um, I Being in social settings, even sometimes among family, is um, is stressful for me. Um, I I can talk a lot, but I can also be really quiet. And it was so funny because my dad's wife said, when I guess when he was having conversations with her about the family, he goes, "Oh, Melonya is a homebody, and she's really quiet. She could be reading something or writing something for hours and be very quiet." And I didn't even know he paid that much attention to me, to be really honest. But it was also insightful to hear, oh, yeah, that is how I was, and I'm still like that. And I remember when I went on a cruise with my dad's wife, we had a great time. But there's times when I just have to be, if I don't have time alone, I don't function well. That's probably why I'm not in a relationship.
Well, and I think that's like a part of it, right? So there's that recovery time for at least, that's part of that bucket. And I don't think we have enough research around adults and autism because there is, and I don't think that this will be coming anytime soon because we're not allowed to do research on anything that might be DEI related, right? Like for the NIH. But I would love, and DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, in case people don't know. But I do think there needs to be more research on aging and autism because the very little research that there is out there is that many autistics, and I'm going to say many autistics as they age suffer from depression. There's high rates of suicide
Mm.
with autistics that are older. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about, what is it to be an intersectional autistic person? Like, what is it to be Black, a woman, and autistic? What is it to be late diagnosed, which is different than, if you're diagnosed as a child and all the supports that might have given you. What does it look like to be autistic? Because I think most people think, because I'll say, oh, and autism, and I don't know sometimes what I want when I'm saying that, but I do know it impacts the social part of my life. Like, because I've talked to you about this. What do I really mean when I say it to a doctor? I don't know. I guess I want them to understand, like, it could go and
Well,
like,
I take in information differently.
yes, that
And I
I take
express
in
information
information
differently.
differently.
Yeah.
But I also shared with you that I had this false belief that when I said that to doctors that they knew something about autism and they would be
Mm.
like, "Oh, you're gonna take the information in differently." So maybe I need to like not read her face the way that I would read somebody else's. Because I tend to have a very like neutral face. Like I'm getting what you're saying because in my head I'm probably having some type of maybe there's nothing, maybe it's empty. But and I thought I was giving them some clue into that, or like, take your time, give me more time so I can sort of process what you're talking about. And I came to realize it means nothing to most clinicians when I
Mm.
say it. They're
Mm.
like, oh, cool. Like, it sounds
Yeah.
good.
Interesting.
Yeah. And like, I'll go back and I'll look at some notes. And I don't think there's even a spot that you can be like, hey, like neurodivergent, like I have different cognitive ways of processing. There isn't something like that. There's a mental health, like, how they have the like, do you have
Depression,
any, yeah, like
anxiety.
that. But this is different because, like, and I think that's the other thing with autism. Like, someone said to me, well, how, like, maybe you have ADHD, or like maybe you have this, or maybe you have that. And the thing is, when I am unregulated in my autism, I can appear like I'm depressed, anxious, ADHD, I can't function, but really I I am overstimulated. Something has happened where I'm overstimulated, or maybe I'm understimulated. Like I'm not interested. So I'm like like looking around. But the one thing I don't notice with you, is I tend to be very stimmy, but that's just because I will self-soothe myself. Like I'm kind of like this a lot, rubbing my fingers on, like that's a low stimulation for me, like something I can hide. But when I'm really overstimulated or understimulated, sometimes I'll rock. I know I've done it. I've looked back and been like, "Whoa, what was I talking about?" And I'm like bopping around, or and I don't and I either do really like intense eye contact or not eye contact. And the Tactique app actually flagged me once because it was like, you make no eye contact and you dominated that conversation. Because that's the other thing. Sometimes autistics can get like, and I hate to say autistics like we're a monolith, but me and my autism, and you called me out on it on the last one. I'll overtalk. Like I'm so excited to talk about
Yeah,
something. I'm like, blah, blah, blah,
I
blah, blah,
expected
blah,
that
blah,
too.
blah. You are not going to get a word in.
I do that.
So,
Hot calling the kettle.
but like, eh, eh, I find it fascinating that in this time when we could be doing so much research, as so many people are bubbling up and saying like, hey, I think maybe school wasn't that great for me, or I'm really struggling with loneliness, or I don't know how to socially interact with people, or I don't socially interact in the ways that, maybe society wants. We could be doing so much more research. We could be doing so much more things to help us as a society, because there is this loneliness crisis going on. And I wonder if we're just all overstimulated, all of us neurodiverse, undiagnosed people, overstimulated, melting down, broken at this point, and we really just need a break. Instead, it's like you're going to have to work more hours, which is not going to help us. You're going to have to come into the office because they're bringing a lot of work from home people back in, right? Like maybe we all kind of like were able to like de-stress during that COVID time for us. I'm spitballing here. This is not true. For us, and now we're being forced back into the workplace, and we're just like, oh my gosh, I can't do it. How did I do it? Like,
You,
but maybe it's because you were autistic
you
or
know
neurodiverse.
what's really interesting is that I when I first started at the position that I'm in, I went and did some classroom observations, and I thought to myself, a couple of things that really stuck out to me is that they rewarded children with candy, and I was like, well, that's going to send you spiking in behavior and dropping in behavior. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how much sugar are we feeding these kids, right? In terms of reward, you can use food as a reward, right? But it could be a piece of fruit, right? I mean, that still has sugar, but there's still some fiber in it. There's no real nutritional value of a piece of candy. But what also struck me is that the walls were so thin that I could hear what was going on in the next room, and the lights were so bright. And I thought to myself, wow, this is the room setting itself is overstimulating, right? I would feel I would think that you would have something that feels a little, for a lack of a better word, cocoonish, right? Things that muffle sounds, low light, again, not feeding folks sugar that, and that sends it stimulates the brain and you're high and then you crash. And what happens when you crash? You're more irritable. You're going to get some negative behaviors. And I just thought to myself, oftentimes organizations are so fixed on growth, right? We need to offer more programs and we need to expand and we need to serve more people. But are you serving the people that you already have to the best of your ability? Is that environment, again, and after that parent had shared with me the experience of their child in the school system, you look at the cafeteria, loud, look at the gym, echoey, loud, and it's like I'm thinking to myself, is this really the right environment?
No, and honestly, when I think about school, I remember just and I went to which is why I say, like, maybe my parents knew something, because I went to a special school when I was a kid. So, I went to a special school in Paterson, which is a it's a urban area, and the school was to mainstream gifted and talented kids, which is code word for probably neurodiverse kids, with, those kids who had physical disabilities together. And so my class was very small. I think there were like 10 kids in a class in each grade level. We had mixed classes where we had third and fourth together, which that's might just be an urban thing when you have not enough teachers.
Mm.
But we had really small classes. We had less than 20, which in an urban area is a small class. And I still felt very overwhelmed most
Mm.
of the time. I was still very quiet kid. We had swim for gym because, there are some activities that like you want to have a pool for if you have kids with physical disabilities and neurocognitive disabilities. There's a different stimulation from that type of gym. So I do think probably there was something somewhere, because I also went to special classes in the second grade and the first grade. So I'm sure there's something. But my parents aren't great historians, so I didn't get the official diagnosis. And I paid to get that official diagnosis because I didn't really know what was wrong. I'd
Well,
gone
how
to
did they
therapy.
diagnose you? What does that
So
look like?
so I did the test that the kids like take, because there isn't really an adult assessment test. And so I met with an assessor. There are people that will give you these assessments. So I met with the assessor, and like, they watched how I did certain things, or like we just chatted. I filled out the paperwork. I had close family members and people who knew me fill out an assessment, and he was like, "Yeah, you are like." But it didn't feel 100% because they were kind of like the questions were questions for kids too, or like it was the standard sort of autism assessment. And I will say that sometimes when I get asked questions like, "Oh, how do you feel?" That's like sometimes the worst question for me because I have no idea. I'm like, "You mean like how do I feel with my?" Like I remember one time someone asked me how I felt when I was younger, and I was like, "With my hand, like with my skin, my fingertips." Like, what are you talking about? Like, how do you feel internally? Do I feel hot? Do I feel physically warm? Like the layers to that question is probably not this for me is probably not the same way that someone neurotypical thinks of. Oh, how are you feeling today? Like, I feel cold. No, you mean emotionally. Okay. So, like, I do think that we need better language to kind of get the information from people, or even just like the way that I think about that question might be a marker. I don't know. But there are certain days when I might have filled out that assessment differently than I filled it out that day. So I do think it's just a moment in time, and like yourself feel like the way that someone feels about the like when you do some reading on autism and you see some of the markers that they say are associated with it, the difference I think is that my life, how it impacted my life, was more severe. Like when people would say, "Oh, everybody gets anxious going into a crowded room or interacting with people." Yes, but it's not a paralyzing anxiety. And maybe for some people it is, but it's not there. Like I'm literally talking myself up every moment of the interaction. And sometimes that comes off as like hey, yeah, I love being here. Oh. Yes. Like, I'm clearly masking. Like, in my mind, I'm clearly masking when I'm outside. But most people are like, "Oh, you're so friendly. You're such a like you seem like such an extrovert." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh, that all was fake." That's why I probably can't have a relationship because, like, they meet, like, the masked version of me, and they're like, "This person is so, like she was so intently interested," and then they, like, get me. They take me home. They've bought the product, and it is defective. No, it's not defective. It's not what they thought it was. Because like, outside me is very different than, like, inside me. Inside me is, like, low key low key. Like, it's a much different yeah, it's much different. Because like, I think I've also been told, like or we've all been sort of told this is like how you act out in the world. And like I can do that really well as long as I have the energy for it. Can I do it consistently? Probably not. Which is why like I'm on a dating app, right? Because I think I want to find love. And like is and I think I wrote like I'm very good at beginnings. And I think people don't get what I'm actually saying. What I mean is I'm gonna be really great then, and then you're gonna be like, "What? Who is this person?" So, you know, I
That
don't know.
that's funny. And if I saw that in a dating, I'm very good at beginnings. I was like, excuse me, but that is a red flag.
It is a red flag. Don't date someone who has that in their that's a red
That
flag for
is so
sure.
funny.
But I
It's a
put it out there. I'm like, basically my whole profile is in inactivity and why someone should not date me. So, I'm always surprised whenever anybody like responds back. Not
that
that I follow through with that, because
that
like
is so funny.
but yeah, so like I'm glad you put that down there. I'm just and I am not a therapist for this. Like I'm just talking about my Melonya and I are just talking about our personal my personal experience with being diagnosed as an adult with autism. And because we were kind of reflecting around like what I said to her. And like she was like, why? What are the symptoms? And like what's wild is as you start to research this, because like whenever, at least for me, when I've gotten diagnosed with something that I didn't know a lot about, I'll go like hard into research. I'm not going to say a lot of it stays in my brain, but I want to almost know everything about it. And what I started to find out was there are some physical markers for autism too, that people will have. Like, and when I say physical markers, I'm talking about like sometimes there's some difficulty with it has to do with so I have this is gonna sound weird. So sometimes I have problems cutting my food. Like, and it makes my fingers feel tired.
Hmm.
Because I have a little bit of issues with like dexterity with my hands. Which sounds scary because I used to do IVs really well. But I think it has to do more with like I'm not great with my this hand holding stuff and like just fatigue with that. I so my I had a this is when teachers used to beat you because I'm that old. I have a callus on this finger because I had a teacher when I was growing up because I didn't hold my pencil right. Because remember we have all those nice things for kids now, like the things you wrap around the pencil, like so it's got a bigger grippy area. We didn't have those. So she taped my finger to a pencil, hit my hand all the time because I couldn't hold it. Like I was awful at writing. So like certain things like that, like your manual dexterity is a marker for autism sometimes. Sometimes people have these like lack of
You know
color
what?
streaks.
I was very and I don't know if this has anything to do with it. I was very clumsy as a kid.
Yes, clumsy is another piece of
I
it.
used to my legs were all marked up because I was constantly falling.
You're
Like,
still clumsy. Don't say clumsy as a kid. You tell me you fall at like the paddle.
well, but that's because I'm walking the dog. I don't
No,
typically
you said you were playing what's that game?
I'm
The
playing
tennis game?
I'm playing pickleball. Yes, I'm
Pickleball.
going
There, I
after
said paddleball.
yeah, I'm going after something, but typically I don't fall. But as a kid, I was constantly falling. I
I walk
mean,
into everything in this house. I'm like, "Wait, where's my legs?"
I was constant. I mean, like my legs were always scarred up from just falling, and it wasn't like there was something in the way or I fell over something. I would just fall. I was constantly scarred up because I was very clumsy. This is really, I mean, it's really kind of interesting. I wonder too, is as a kid, if I had attention deficit disorder because I could not sit still. I, you
Or
know,
and I'll throw this out there because I said so my son has an autism diagnosis. I took him to the assessor and I said, "Well, what about ADHD? Because he seems very like all over the place." And she said, "He's just unregulated. He just is like his autism is like right now he's so overstimulated he's appearing that way, so let's come back when he gets everything like kind of like settled." And I thought that was interesting because I've had moments where I'm like, I think like I've even said it to I'm like, I think I have ADHD and no, maybe you're unregulated. Like, are you regulated in your autism? That I'm not saying that people can't have both diagnoses, but I'm also saying if your diagnosis is ASD or if you think you're autistic, like, do you have all the supports? Are you at your healthiest before we start adding like other things like on there? Uh, I'm not saying that this isn't possible, but I know that I can be very like, where am I? What am I doing when I feel overwhelmed? So, but at my baseline, I'm pretty like I know when I'm at my happy place because I'm like very much like all about the logic and the like, well, and there's a different way. When I'm like not well overstimulated, I'm all over. Like I can't I've been overstimulated since the election, I think. But
mm,
yeah. Yeah, because
yeah.
my brain's been all over the place. It's been hard to focus. I admit to that.
That's why I took some time last week because I was, and again, I anxiety, I just normally, right? But that too comes from trauma, in childhood. Um, but I just I find myself really disappointed at where we are in society. I think there we have so many resources to really make life quite um, pleasant for people, right? To really, and I, for the lack of a better word, I'll say the word accommodate, but
Mm.
to really help create Indy, she don't. She's getting all geared up because it's trash collection Friday, and trucks are just too much. Talk about overstimulation, but I just think we have the resources to really. I mean, we're going back on the Department of Education. We have such an opportunity to make education so robust. Here she goes. So robust, so enlightened, right? And so the opportunity that you had growing up in school, when you say you had 10 kids in a classroom, teachers would kill to have
For
a
that.
classroom that had 10. But shouldn't that be the norm?
It should. But I will say, like, I don't know if the teachers where I went to school, like, enjoyed it. Because when I say when I look back, I'm like, those ki I'm like, "I think there might have been some piece of paperwork my parents didn't read. Because like, when I say that classroom I feel bad for those teachers. We were all over the place with probably what our diagnoses were, right? Like just like super smart kids and like also kids that like were someplace else on like reading level, but we were all thrown in together because I guess the thought was like we're all going to bring each other along in different ways and give different pieces of stuff, which is, like good or bad, like it is what it is. But um I still hated school. And like my niece has an autism diagnosis, and my in-laws, they'll say, like my brother will say to me, she's so difficult to get to school. She
Mm,
don't want to go. She cries, she has a temper tantrum. Um and I said something to my sister-in-law. I said, I remember going to school felt like being born again every single day. It felt
mm,
like the trauma of that, of coming to this noisy, awful, like, and that is why I wanted to scream most days. Like when you're born, they acknowledge your entry into the world by like, did you scream loud enough? Right? It's so much, it's so overwhelming. And school felt like that every day because for me at least, I like a little bit of a pattern to something so that I can say, "Oh, okay, I see this. I understand." Like this, it settles me. It comforts me a little bit. Like there's probably like what might be OCD, right? So some like there's like I'm a little obsessive about things being something the same, something the same. And so school felt very much like nothing was the same other than it was in the same building.
mhm,
Like, because sometimes they make you shift your seats. Sometimes you have to move to the other side. Like sometimes you have to do all these things, and none of them feel to be within your control. And like it did feel like school was the worst place to be. And it's so bright. There's very little. It's like you're. And I didn't go to kindergarten, so I didn't have nap time and those quiet moments. But like it did feel like there needed to be some time in school to just like pause and be like, what did we just do? Can I take it in? Can I like have a moment to like process that? That doesn't happen.
mm-mm,
Like lunch break is not the time for that, right? Because it's even worse. It's just like chaos. Like you don't know where you're going in the cafeteria. So I do feel like school is traumatic for most ND folks. Like totally makes sense. Even schools that are supposed to be quote special schools for kids, they still approach it from that same like I want to reward you when you start to act more like everybody else in society. But that's just masking. You're just teaching people to high mask and hide what feels comfortable. It's literally like saying to someone, I want you to walk and I'm only gonna like you only have one leg, but you have this crutch, and I want you to walk exactly the way everybody else does. It's impossible. Like it is impossible. And not accommodate and then saying, I want you to keep up with us. I want you to like why aren't you doing this? I've given you some type of support. You've given me a support, great, but I do like, why can't we do it the way that I feel comfortable? And we don't do that at all. Like, what would learning look like if neurodiverse people designed those schools? And I've seen some schools where they seem to lean into that. And I'm not saying that your school is a bad school or a good school or anything like that. But I know that the general school that I went to, and then when I went to high school, I went to one of the larger high schools in New Jersey. I felt completely lost, like, and like just completely out of my element. So I do think there's more people who just your diet, like you were getting through society as like someone who would have been characterized as Asperger's, or they say ASD1, high functioning. No, I think you were making it through and you weren't causing a problem. And usually that's what happens, right? If something doesn't cause a problem to society or cause a problem to you until it starts to be a problem, we don't ask questions. We float through. And like that's what started me on the diagnosis is I was like this keeps coming up with people, like with loved ones. Like you don't get it. You're not a social person. And the social part was starting to impact my life and my relationships. And like, I feel like I felt caring, but no one was seeing that. And the other thing, which we don't realize with autism or some people with autism, we can be hyper empathetic. We can be so empathetic, it's paralyzing. We have like for many of us, we have a internal sense of justice that is so hardwired. Like I've done it with you. Like and I'm not saying my sense of justice is a right sense of justice. We're so tied to it that I'm like, no, let me get my point. Like, I want to tell you,
I'm the
like
same
I'm
way.
I'm tied to it. Like I'm like sometimes I'm not even hearing stuff because I'm like yeah. So, but this is just like, for me, and I don't think the autism diagnosis, every single autistic person is going to be different because you're talking about the brain. Our brains are so like misunderstood, under researched, so powerful. Who knows? Maybe we are the original biologic AIs.
It's really very interesting, and I worked in the school system years ago as a teacher's aide for pre-K and kindergarten children, and we were talking about education, and I just think there's such opportunities to create these wonderful learning experiences that are enriched, and it saddens me because I think over the last few years I've gotten a chance to see the deficits of our education system, and I wonder what's going to happen that for students who are neurodiverse, right? With cuts, and then with states being able to decide what gets funded, what gets taught, how it's taught. I just wonder if the work that has been done over the past maybe 10, 15 years in this field will kind of come to a crashing, halt, because it of finding accommodations for this group of learners and group of people and adults is not a priority, right?
Yeah. And, there's some studies now, or there's been some research around the aging brain. And if you think about the fact that Social Security is shifting forward in the US, at least, supports for that and what that looks like, what does that mean for autistic people who are aging? What we haven't really studied the aging autistic mind enough to really be able to say, like, oh, I should be able to push it to 72. If my marker is age 50, where I'm starting to see different changes in the brain. And remember, we're comparing that neural diverse brain to neurotypical brains, right? Is it that I'm aging? Is it that I'm having different cognitive function, or function that might impact my psychosocial or how I retire in the world? Or is this my brain being more plastic and fluid and like open to more learning, but I'm shutting down or sparking other areas that neurotypicals aren't sparking? And what does that mean for me? Because we don't have any depth of wealth of research into that. And a lot of the research we have with autism is, how do I take you and make you neurotypical? I don't want a cure, but what I do want is the freedom to be who I am, which might be an out of the box thinker who might come up with some really great stuff at every different decade of my life, if I'm allowed to do that and not have, because masking is exhausting. It
You
is
know,
exhausting.
CBS a couple of years ago did a really great segment on companies who were finding opportunities for autistic employees. What the statistics we're finding is that autistic people were going to college, right, getting degrees, and then not finding jobs and living with their parents, right?
It's
And
our interview skills.
right, and then companies started, a few companies who are forward thinking started looking at some of the talents of some of the autistic people, And like, and they did they gave a demonstration. There was a whole page. Somebody was being interviewed. An autistic person was being interviewed. Their talent was being able to find an anomaly in a whole sheet of data. They could within seconds find the anomaly on the sheet and point to it. Whole sheet of numbers or whatever the case may be, and they go, you hold up the sheet, and they go, up, there it is, boom, there it is. And the person that was interviewing them would never have caught that mistake or whatever that quickly. But these companies who were forward thinking said, we have a place for them, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a place for them. This person may be a fantastic worker, but we need to put them in a place where the lights are more dim, where there might be less audio stimulation or visual stimulation or whatever. And they're doing fantastic work, and they are a valued member of our team, but they're different, right? And I just it saddens me to think that we are moving in a direction where there's just less tolerance for difference, and which means that there's going to be greater numbers of people who are going to be outside of society, and that means as a whole society we're going to be diminished because these folks are not bringing their gifts and their values into the world. And I'm hoping that we don't allow that to happen. I hope we don't.
I hope so too. And I do think the workplace is a sort of minefield if you're on the spectrum, because the interview, right? Everybody says, like, you send your resume, you do the phone interview, whatever. But the interview piece is really where people start to grade you, right? Like on how they think you're going to, quote, fit into the organization, not necessarily what skills or thoughts or innovations, but just how you will fit into. And if you're a square, remember that show Square Pegs? If you're a square peg trying to be slammed into a round hole, that's really hard. And where you might blossom is not in the interview process. Like if your interviewer is like, why is this person not making eye contact with me? Like
Mhm.
that's a red flag for many interviewers. Or why isn't this person as like, what about the tone of their voice, or why did they not ask me a question, or why did they not answer this way? So I think the interview is almost like a minefield that can exclude um like neurodiverse people. I
Mhm.
do also feel like there's a lot of bias around neurodiversity. Like I remember working someplace and we had a nurse who had ADHD, and the one administrator was like, they shouldn't be a nurse. And I was like, well, why? I didn't
Mm.
understand why. Like, and so even disclosure comes with its own challenges. Like I disclose now, but I work for myself. What would that look like if I were to disclose someplace who had a lot of like misconceptions and biases about what it means to be autistic? Maybe they would not see me as able to, like, if I apply for a role, that means I think I can do the job. Like and the reason why I say that is, as a woman, like, the intersectionality and the layers of imposter syndrome that jump in when you're a woman, when you're queer, when you're neurodiverse, and when you're Black. Like, there's so much there. I don't apply for stuff unless I'm like, oh my gosh, I met every single thing. Like, I really know I can do it. So sometimes when I hear some of these questions in interviews, I'm like, I wouldn't apply if I didn't think I could do it. So my autistic mind probably gives the worst answer to those questions. It's like, because I can, like, not enough info there. But I do think, like, with more openness about, what it is to work, I think more people probably are neurodiverse, and I think you're neurodiverse. And now we're accepting self-diagnosis too. So I think, like, because it is not in the US, it's not necessarily covered by insurance. If you believe that you have these, then you have it. Like, you're the only person who knows your body. Um, I did it because the reason why I got a diagnosis and paid to get a diagnosis, and it was not cheap, it was over $1,000 to get diagnosed, which is, I would use the F word, but I'm not going to, which is ridiculous. Um, for me, it gave me a lot of information, but I also think it's unfair and it's a privilege thing that people have to pay many times to get diagnosed in the US. And then I also worry too about what does it mean when we start turning into a society that is no longer okay with difference? What does it mean that I've said I'm autistic? Like, some countries see that as a disability where you can't drive because you're autistic. So, like, I do sort of, I have so many thoughts around this, but
That's interesting. Well, we're at the hour. Thank you for, sharing some moments, talking about something that's really real for you and could be real for me and a lot of other people. I don't know. I'm hoping that when we move, I'm hoping that we move past what we're going through now to something that is, I think, children and generations coming up really deserve a better world, and a world where people can be different and appreciated and recognized for their contributions, even though it might not look like everybody's contribution. And I hope that it sounds really silly, probably, and utopian like, but I'd like to see a gentler, a more gentle world where it's not so bombastic in terms of stimulus, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of, and everything. But we can only, do our best one little step at a time. But thank you for this additional, uh, you know, um, conversation. And but before we leave, I do want to share, because I've been telling everyone to start a garden, right? And
I
so
love.
here are my cowpeas and my pinto beans that have sprouted. I feel like a little kid. It is bringing me great joy during this time of turmoil, to start my elevated raised bed garden from seeds, no less. So, uh, you know,
So
send
envious.
positive energy. But it was great to have a second edition today, talking about autism, some of the diagnosis, some of the experiences that folks have. And
And I just want to say, any words that we used here, these are my words. They're not necessarily, they don't resonate with everybody. Please don't send me hate words if I said something that you don't agree with. This is just my experience with autism and my thoughts being autistic and being sitting in this intersectional space. If I did not use the latest language or something around that, it is because it is my diagnosis, and sometimes it's depressing. I'm going to admit that it's depressing to go read things about the diagnosis too, or things that are going on.
yeah,
So that is why sometimes I'm not 100%.
yeah,
I will say autism stuff should be done by autism people. We understand what it is to live in this body. So I don't want to be neurotypical. So I don't want a cure for autism. I do find it a little disturbing. And I know we're going a little longer because I forgot to say this. All the vaccine stuff, like, you don't want to get a vaccine for your kid because you don't want them to be autistic. Think about the message that sends to all of the autistic people out here. Like, there's nothing wrong with me, honestly. And it wasn't caused from a vaccine.
there you
So,
go.
but there's nothing wrong with me.
Yeah, we're
Like,
just
there's
different.
nothing wrong with being autistic.
Everybody's
So
different.
when I see that as hate.
Yeah,
Honestly, that's how I feel. Like, all the autistic people I know are amazing, and I wouldn't want them any other way.
there you go. Well, thank you for this second edition of MT Fridays. We'll be back next week. And take care of yourself. Stay curious.
Thanks for
See you
joining
next
us
time.
on MT Fridays. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to like, subscribe, and share for more insightful discussions every Friday. Remember, the brain drain stops here, so keep the conversation going by connecting with us on social media or visiting our website. Until next time, stay curious and keep filling your mind with knowledge. See you next week, Friday, on MT Fridays.